Have you bought a bunch of effects pedals to sound like your favorite guitar heroes, but then you plug in and play and something just, it doesn't sound right, not what you were expecting? Well, there's a good chance you just have your pedal order a little out of whack or your signal chain. Or maybe you've got a bunch of pedals and you haven't even put them together yet because you're just not even sure where to begin. Maybe feeling a little overwhelmed what pedal should go where. In either case, you've come to the right place because in this video, I'm going to go over some basic guidelines and principles to help you construct and optimize your signal chain to get the best possible sound. If it's your first time here, welcome to Precision Guitar Academy. My name is Jeff, and I'm so happy you're here so I can share with you today what I've learned about pedal order. Let's get to it. So a good first step, I think, would be to kind of define what some of the categories are of the effects pedals. They can roughly be, I guess, categorized into about 6 different groups. You've got your utility pedals. That's going to be things like your tuners, buffers. I put noise gates in that category. Then you've got your filters pedals, which would be things like your wah, your equalization. Then you've got dynamics, that'll be compressors, volume pedals. Then you've got your gain stage pedals, this is overdrives, distortions, fuzz pedals, although there's a little catch with the fuzz pedals I'll get to in a minute. Then you've got your modulation pedals, and that would be phasers, flangers, chorus, tremolo. And then your time and space pedals, which is your reverb and delay. Alright, so now that we've defined the categories of pedals we're going to be working with here, we'll get into the order they should go in. It's not just as linear as, you know, all the utility pedals followed by the filters, followed by the dynamics, etc., etc. There's a little more variance to it than that. I mean, you could do it that way. Like, none of these are hard, fast rules. These are just guidelines that should generally give you pretty solid results. Anyway, I see I've got a little error here in this flow chart that I'll have to fix. But generally speaking, this buffer should be after the tuner. The tuner should be first. You always want to hit your tuner first because you want the cleanest, purest, absolutely unaltered sound or signal going to that tuner. So then after the tuner, if you needed to have a buffer, you would put the buffer next. Then I've got the wah pedal here. This is filters. It says wah and EQ. And then you probably can't see this too well in the video, but I will provide this. If you want a copy of my flowchart here, you can just put in the comments order, and I'll fix this error before I go making that available. But the next item here would be the filters, and I've got the wah and the EQ. The EQ can actually, that one's a little more flexible. It can go early in the chain like this, or sometimes people put it in the effects loop. You know, it could go after your modulation pedals. That one's kind of going to depend on what you think sounds good. Next, we got dynamics, and you probably do want your compressor here. It's good to have your compressor before any of your gains and distortion, because that way it just helps to like even out the dynamics of your playing, and it's good to have that before you start adding a bunch of gain to it. Now the volume pedal, however, if you have that one's a little more, it's like the EQ, you can kind of play around with that one. It'll operate differently based on where you put it. If you put it here prior to the distortion, it's almost, it'll operate similar to like another gain. And basically what it would be kind of a redundant volume like on your guitar. It would kind of operate that way. But the nice thing would be you could operate it with your foot instead of having to reach down for your volume knob. Sometimes though, people may put it after the gain stages, like maybe even after, and you could put it like in the effects loop, I suppose. But if you put it after the gain, then it's going to operate more as like a master volume. It's not going to control the gain anymore because now the distortion pedal is taking care of that, but it will adjust your overall volume. So that one, the volume, you can kind of monkey around with where you put that. Then we've got our gain stages. And so this is your overdrives, distortion, and your fuzz. Okay, something I should point out though, with fuzz pedals and with wah, if they're like a vintage pedal, they might have a silicone or germanium based transistor, which basically means they're what we call impedance sensitive. And I can't speak to whether or not your pedals would be this, but they'll probably be pretty old. But if you have some like that, you need them to go first in your chain. They have to be before any kind of a buffer. That's an oddball if you have anything like that, but it's something to look out for. But otherwise, like I was saying, overdrive, distortion, and fuzz. Now you may or may not have these pedals. I've never owned a distortion pedal. I always use my amp's natural distortion in the preamp gain. But a person could have still a distortion or an overdrive or fuzz. Sometimes I think a boost pedal may be classified in the same group. Now if you have all those variations, what order do you put them in? That's kind of an up for grabs. I've heard some people say go low to high. So you'd go like boost, overdrive, distortion, and then fuzz is kind of its own wild card. As long as it's not one of those classic vintage ones, you kind of put it whatever sounds best. And then I've heard some other people say the exact opposite. They like going high gain to low gain. So distortion, overdrive, boost. And so you'll have to just kind of experiment with that and see what sounds best to you. But after those gain stages, that's when we get into what we call the modulation pedals. And my graphic kind of shows a flanger pedal here to cover that group. But we're talking flangers, phasers, chorus, tremolo. What else do I got on there? Vibrato. Quite a few pedals fall into that category. And then after the modulation, you've got your time and space category, which is delay and reverb. Now, if your amp has an effects loop, delay and reverb, you probably almost for sure want to put in that effects loop. And the reason being is because if you have an effects loop, then that basically means your amp has two sections. It's got the preamp, which is where it has its own built-in gain for distortion. Then you've got your effects loop, which kind of is like in between, and then the power amp. So the two amp parts are your preamp and your power amp. And the effects loop is like after the preamp. And so what happens with that is you want your reverb and delay after the preamp so that you want to delay and reverb your distortion. You don't want to distort your delay and reverb, is kind of the way I've heard it explained. And that makes sense. But again, if you may find artistic reasons where you want to experiment with putting them, to your amps in so that they go before the preamp. And maybe it sounds really cool to have them distorted for whatever song you're writing. But the other thing with the effects loop is some people will put their modulation pedals in the effects loop. Some people I've even heard will put their EQ in the effects loop. And I may tinker with that, quite honestly. So how do you know if your amp has an effects loop? Well, I don't want to say always, but my experience has been for the most part, they'll be on the back of your amplifier. I won't say always because as soon as I say that, someone's going to say, I got them on the front. But you should see two jacks, an effects send and an effects return, and a lot of times they'll abbreviate it with just the letters FX. So FX send and FX return. And then like on my 5150 amp, it literally says effects loop and then it says send and return. But my Marshall and my Fender, they both just say effects send and effects return. And I'll do a separate video on how that all works, because it's kind of its own subject. We get into the 4-cable method and this and that. So anyway, so the time and space, this is another one of those things where, like, I'd say probably 80% of people go delay and then reverb, but I saw one person on a video say he likes it the opposite way. So that'll again come down to if you're trying to emulate somebody's sound, you probably want to follow what they're doing, or if you're doing your own original things, you're going to have to go with what sounds right to you. And then at the very end of all that, if you are running into signal loss issues and things like that because you've got the long cable runs going on, then you may want to put another buffer at the end. So if you would like a copy of this little flow chart here, again, just comment order down in the comments and I'll get one to you with that little situation corrected. And then I'll also include a list of all the pedal categories and get a little more inclusive on just the ones I listed today as far as which pedals fall into which category. So before we take a look at my board real quick, just to throw out one last item that's not a pedal per se, but it's definitely something that's important that will contribute to your sound quality. I definitely recommend getting an isolated power supply. I tried a daisy chain power when I first got my first couple pedals, and it only took 2 pedals for me to be getting a lot of bad noise. And that's just something that you are gonna probably run into if you try to use one of those daisy chain things. Honestly, your sound would be better off just using 9-volt batteries at that point. Your pocketbook wouldn't be, but your sound quality would be much better. All right, so I'll get my board in the shot here, and we'll have a quick run through of that, and I'll show you kind of how mine compares with this chart, why I set it up the way I set it up, and what I'm thinking I'm going to change. All right, so I grabbed my board here. I'll just run through it real quickly. I made a whole nother video where I ramble on about my pedals and the order I've got them hooked up. You can check that video out if you're really interested, and I'll just put a link to that one in the description. But in a quick nutshell, what I tried to mostly do was emulate kind of the classic Van Halen, like on the first record, that kind of a setup. So except for these 2 pedals, but I did want to have a tuning pedal, so I have my tuner first, just like the flowchart's supposed to show, and the free copy I make available to you will have that corrected. And then I have my wah pedal, and then this kind of after the wah pedal is where it starts to be more like going after the vintage Van Halen. I got a 6-band MXR EQ, which gives me a lot of noise, probably because I'm going into the preamp of my amplifier. So I've boosted the mid frequencies on this, and then it's going into the gain stage of my amp and it's getting boosted more. So I have a noise gate connected to that. And then out of the noise gate, this is kind of a fancy noise gate. It's 4-cable method compatible. I'm not going to get into that discussion right now. We'll save that for a future video. But basically I can run this through my effects loop, and so I'm able to branch off of this, and then we got the Echoplex delay and an MXR reverb. Those do go in my effects loop, and then coming out of the other side with my modulation pedals, I'm still going into the front of the amp. So when I say it's going into the preamp, basically what that means is it's going into the input jack on the front of my amplifier, and so then the preamp is still affecting these pedals with the gain and whatnot. So anyway, I've got my Phase 90, my flanger, and my chorus. Now, something I'm considering doing is I may change some of this up. I know I touched on it earlier in the video. I might just put this EQ in my effects loop, because since of the way I'm using it is boosting those frequencies, maybe I won't get the noise if I put it after the preamp. It's just something I'm considering. And then for that matter, if I'm going to go to that extent, I might just put the modulation pedals in there too. But you know, that's part of the fun with the pedals. We get to play around with them, figure out what we think sounds best. So if you want to hear how this all sounds, I recommend that you check out my cover of Van Halen's Eruption. It's only a couple minutes long, and I used this exact board through my Marshall combo amp in that particular video. My 5150 was in the shop. So thanks for watching. I hope you found this video valuable. And one last time, if you did want a copy of this flowchart, it'll look better. My printer's kind of funny with the ink, but you'll get a very nice PDF. And I'll also include a better list of the pedal categories, which pedals go in those categories, as well as like a bullet list of tips, just to kind of summarize what we talked about. So thank you so much, and I'll see you on that next video.